Let's go back to the 80s, an era where wargaming has already gripped the hearts and wallets of legions of nerds, and role-playing games are right behind and growing in popularity. We find ourselves in Sweden, a market where TSR has not yet set up shop and where the language barrier allows for the proliferation of a game other than D&D. A decidedly more Swedish one. Yes, I'm talking about Drakar och Demoner. I'm sure I botched the pronunciation, but I speak 3 languages and Swedish is not one of them. Today, on the Bronze Dragon Inn, we're talking about Dragonbane, Drakar och Demoner's newest cousin, and specifically 5 things I think it does better than D&D. And 1 thing I think it does worse for good measure. Before I dive into what about this nifty little game has inspired me, I should mention that I filled out a form in my email to get this copy for free, and the people from Free League Publishing sent me this cute box set with a matching DM screen, but they didn't pay me to make this video, so the following opinions are still my own. My favorite mechanic from Dragonbane is actually one that I homebrewed into D&D sometime back in Shikar: camping. For a group of adventurers traveling together on the medieval fantasy version of a road trip, it's actually sad how little 5th edition D&D talks about what the bulk of the adventure would look like, which is finding places to sleep and finding things to eat. Dragonbane has a wonderful suite of rules and mechanics to keep camping and sleeping interesting in the game, and allows for time to be spent not only fishing and foraging, but even cooking your catch. In a lot of campaigns, I feel like D&D classes like Rangers get overlooked because depending on how you spec them, their more survival-oriented traits are suboptimal compared to combat perks. But in Dragonbane, a character skilled in bushcraft and fishing is a blessing to the party instead of being dead weight. I enjoy survival mechanics, especially in long-form campaigns, because of how they mark the passage of time. You get to see the seasons shift as you go on this adventure together, and it also really immerses the players in the story when the weather isn't just a little line in the scene narration, but rather something the players have to grapple and engage with. Maybe the thick snow on the ground makes it difficult to find plants to eat and forces you to rely more on hunting. No matter which way you spin it, mechanics like these really make you feel like you're part of this fantasy story. But we've talked about the weather long enough, so let's move on to the second thing I think Dragonbane does better than D&D. And this one might be a little controversial, but Dragonbane allows magic users to cast spells that they don't have prepared. And I might actually house rule this into any 5th edition campaigns I run in the future. Hear me out before any sorcerers get mad at me. In Dragonbane, if you don't have a spell prepared, but you do have your spellbook on you, you can cast the spell as usual, but it takes twice as long to cast. So if a fire spell would normally take 1 action in combat, now it takes 2. I think this is brilliant. Not only does it feel thematic in the sense that it takes longer to cast because your character is flipping feverishly through their spellbook trying to find the right spell while being attacked, also because this is a spell your character knows. Sure, maybe they didn't spend all morning memorizing it right before this particular fight, but they have ostensibly learned it and cast it before. Why is it so out of the question for them to whip out their spellbook and try to find the place in their book where they're pretty sure they wrote it down? Mechanically, I feel like this makes sense too. Nothing feels worse than going into a battle where you need, thunder damage, and realizing you have thunder spells but didn't prepare any of them. As a frequent wizard player, I know this feeling all too well. Knowing that the perfect spell is just sitting there on your list, but it's just not the one you prepped today. With Dragonbane, it's nice to have everything you've learned at your disposal, even if it takes you a second to find it. It's like an open book test, which I never really understood the point of, but whatever. Let's get to point number 3, critical hits. Now, this game calls them dragons, and they occur on a 1 instead of a 20, but they're so much fun. On melee attacks, a crit can be used in a traditional way to give you double the damage dice, but you can also choose to negate any armor that the target is wearing. Alternatively, you can also opt to perform a second attack for free against a completely different enemy. So if a target is low on health, you no longer have to feel like the crit was wasted. You can simply choose to opt out of the double damage option and hit another target instead, making critical hits exciting, whether the target has 3 health or 30. And Dragonbane spells can crit too. You can not only double the damage or the range of a spell, but you can also choose to either have the spell be cast for free, that means no willpower spent, or you can cast an additional spell on your turn, although you do so at disadvantage. This makes crits on non-damage spells actually matter, since they can help you not only conserve your resources, but they also help your willpower go farther faster. I think we can safely make the case that crits in Dragonbane are more exciting than in D&D, if we're using the rules as written. And the players have more strategies to employ on the battlefield. Number 4, I think Dragonbane handles the way it measures time and rest better than D&D. You have a few different ways to track time, including a round, which is your standard combat round of 10 seconds, a stretch, which is 15 minutes, or a shift, which is 6 hours. Just like in the real world, there are 4 shifts in a day. Dragonbane has an interesting mechanic wherein you can actually rest during all 3 of these. What that means is you can rest during combat. Now, don't get too excited though. You can only regain willpower and not hit points, but if you're a magic user, it's not a bad option. Then you have your stretch rest, which, as the name implies, is kind of like stretching your legs, but you're only allowed to do this once per shift. I love that Baldur's Gate 3 has mechanics limiting the number of short rests you can take in a day. I just feel like it makes dungeons and prolonged quests more interesting, which theoretically you can do in D&D 5e, but can sometimes be hard to track as the DM when you're playing in an actual session. Dragonbane simplifies this by breaking down a play session into clear sections and then limiting the rest based off of it. The end result is you don't get players abusing short rests to make certain classes, warlocks, outshine classes that have more staying power when you have to wait to take a nap. Even with shift rests that are the equivalent of a D&D long rest, as we discussed earlier when talking about those fun camping mechanics, you might not always want or be able to rest. I mean, somebody's got to keep watch, and there are still fish to catch and cooking to do, and wasting away all that time sleeping could really sandbag your party. And now we come to the 5th and last mechanic that Dragonbane crushes on: initiative. Instead of rolling for initiative, you draw cards from a shuffled deck and get to redraw at the end of every round of combat. That means if you roll low at the very beginning of combat, you get a new chance at the top of every round to draw something higher. Now, I know for people with high initial modifiers, this might be a little annoying, but I mean, we've all felt the sting of going dead last and having all of our tactical plans foiled. In the online discourse, I often hear about how a lot of players find combat boring, especially in games that they watch, and I think this helps shake that up a little. Every round is different and is a lot less predictable when the boss goes from acting dead last to getting 3 actions at the top of the round. I feel like this keeps players on their toes and helps keep everyone at the table engaged, especially when you account for the wait rule, which allows you to trade your initiative card with another player who hasn't had their turn yet. I feel like this mechanic is a lot more useful than the hold action mechanic, which isn't as versatile. I'm sure some people will say that there would be balance issues, but in Dragonbane, a lot of the enemies have more than one initiative and get to act more than once every round, so I think the players need all the help they can get. Well, I've talked at length about all the bits of Dragonbane that I like, but there are a few things about it that I'm not the biggest fan of. The world as it exists in the book might not be the most enticing for me personally, but that might also be because as a writer, I prefer to create my own settings for the most part, so I'll gloss over some of my smaller nitpicks and instead get to a big one that might not seem like a big deal, but really bugged me. Opposed roles. In Dragonbane, you don't really have many opposed roles, and when you do, the way they resolve just feels unsatisfactory, which as an avid fan of Vampire the Masquerade and D&D, I just have a hard time with. Whether it's a saving throw or a suspicious guard rolling their insight against your deception, Rolling the bones to see who comes out the victor is always entertaining, and Dragonbane is a game that prefers to have players roll against set values. Even parrying in this game, which is a cool mechanic within itself, is rolled against a player's own skill with a weapon and has nothing to do with the attacker. Rolling to parry against a dragon has the same threshold of success as trying to parry a lone skeleton, and in some ways, that just feels silly. Now, there are weapon durability mechanics that help balance this out, but in general, it just feels a little uninspired. Pair that with the fact that on the rare occasion you do have an opposed roll, the lower roll wins, and that just really makes me itch. I understand this is a game where you want to roll lower than your skill, and I get that. The higher your skill, the better the chance that you'll roll under that value. That part makes sense. I also understand that with a system like this, generally rolling lower is better, but in an opposed roll, if you and your opposer both succeed on your actions, I think we should follow Pendragon rules that the higher roll wins. And here's why. Let's say I challenge you to a fishing contest. I have a fishing skill of 18 and I roll a 17. I succeed. Now let's say you have a fishing skill of 10 and you roll a 9 and you succeed as well. So we've got a tie. According to the game rules, since you have a lower number, that would render you the winner, but I kind of like the Pendragon logic that says that the higher roll should win. Because if I succeeded with a higher roll, wouldn't that imply that I'm a more skilled fisherman than you? I don't know, maybe I'm being too picky. Let me know your thoughts. They did include a solo adventure to get started with in the box, and I haven't played it yet. But if you want to see me give it a try, hop on over to the Patreon and let me know. In the meantime, I'll see you next time on the Bronze Dragon Inn, if we're still in business.